Hello everyone, welcome to our first live stream. I'm hoping this is working. This is the first time I've ever done this. So we are trying something new, and that's what I like to do is always try new things, see what works, what doesn't work, and we'll go from there. And so I thought it'd be a neat idea to do a run through of our sessions that we did a couple years ago just over a year ago actually, for our Strong Towns group, which is basically take a few not just bikes videos and talk about them and see how they apply to where we live here in Langley. But I think these things really apply everywhere. And I call them the introduction to Strong Towns. And obviously this video is not made by me. The video I'll be playing in the background is made by Not Just Bikes. And yeah, let's get started with that and let's talk about it as we go.
In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of strong towns and some of their core topics that will be discussed later in this series. Strong Towns was started in 2008 by Charles Marone. He says his friends call him Chuck, so I guess I'll call him Charles. Charles worked as a civil engineer in Minnesota, and he noticed that the cities and towns he worked for were growing and building lots of roads and infrastructure that he helped to design. But somehow, these growing cities were also going deeper and deeper in debt every year. In short, they were building lots of roads and development projects, but still going broke. He discovered this wasn't just something that happened in his part of the country. Rather, towns and cities all over the United States, and in Canada too, were on a similar path of decline. And it all stemmed from the American pattern of city development that had started after the Second World War. Strong Towns calls this the suburban experiment, a method of development that is drastically different than any other in the history of cities. But I'll talk about that in more detail in a future video. As Charles started investigating further, it became clear that the American system of growth and development was fundamentally broken, and it has guaranteed the decline of American cities. Now for me, that's about where I stopped. Personally, I had moved cities so many times that I no longer had a home anymore, so there was no incentive for me to stay in any one place and fight to make it better. Instead, my wife and I researched what we thought was the best place in the world for us to live, and did everything we could to move there. Charles, on the other hand, was braver, more patriotic, and maybe crazier, depending on the way you look at it. He realized there were places in America that were not broken, places that had built wealth and prosperity, and that could do it again. The downtowns, the main streets, the streetcar suburbs of the early 20th century. These were places that had good bones.
Alright, of course someone rings the doorbell right in the middle of the first live stream. That's why I had to disappear off. But yes, so this is the interesting thing of the difference between Not Just Bikes and Strong Towns. So Not Just Bikes, he couldn't make it work. He decided to immigrate overseas, which I totally respect. Whereas Strong Towns is about trying to fix the problem. So it can be, and Strong Towns has talked about this topic a lot. So do you stay where you are or do you move to where the problem's been solved? So Strong Towns really fights for trying to fix these issues. And that's why, that's the response. We might say, well, you live in the suburbs, why don't you just move downtown if that's what you want? But for a lot of people, that's not possible. The cost, because we have, through planning and other decisions, we've made these areas more scarce, the sort of walkable, livable urban areas. They've become, over time, as we've restricted them with zoning regulations, they've become rarer and thus more desirable and more expensive. So what Strong Towns is fighting for is to make them more common again, make urban, livable, strong places more abundant.
And could be built upon to rebuild American cities. Once you learn about strong towns, you'll start to understand why car-dependent suburbia can't continue. It's not a matter of preference or how people want to live. These places simply cannot sustain themselves. I believe that the material of strong towns is absolutely necessary to understanding how successful cities work. If you travel to cities all around the world, you'll start to see surprising similarities in the way they've been built. For centuries, cities were designed such that everyone had what they needed within walking distance. There may have been horse, rail, or streetcar connections between places, but once you got to where you were going, you could access everything you needed to on foot.
So again, yeah, this is kind of explaining how cities used to be made versus how they're made today. So when, in the past, when someone was building a town from scratch, from nothing, well, multiple people, the community was building it from nothing, there were no cars. So they would make sure that they would try to make it as convenient as possible. That keeps things close together and denser and walkable. There's a natural tendency that when you have community involvement in the design and building of a city, as for a bottom up, as opposed to a top down, you end up with a natural human sort of component. It naturally becomes human scale because people are less interested in building mega projects like big malls. They don't have the financial resources. They'll just do small shops which are close together, and people will be like, I want to live near this stuff here, these stores, so I'll build my house near that. So that creates there's a natural pull towards having everything you need on foot when it's a bottom-up and organic, naturally formed communal process. That's kind of the secret, I would say the secret source of Strong Towns, perhaps. Of course, and he'll go into this in a bit, that's not how we build things today. Today we have a sort of plan by committee / developer-led approach where big money interests and not necessarily you almost have to have a lot of money in a way because of the way the system's set up, and then you get big master planned communities that are not as livable just because the approach is fundamentally flawed. It will never have the attention to detail compared to what one person designing it can never have the same attention to detail as 100 people who want to live there or already do live there are paying attention to it. And that's kind of, again, the point of Strong Towns is to empower those people to make those changes.
Public spaces were designed like an outdoor room, places that feel comfortable to be in and enjoyable to walk in. These are the kind of places Americans go to on vacation and then return home to their depressingly, soul-crushingly dystopian car-dependent suburbs. There's always a fine-grained mix of uses. A very typical configuration is commercial properties on the ground floor with apartments or offices above. Most critically, these properties are flexible. A shop might turn into a house might turn into an office. These are places that could...
So that's another great point that I always like to bring up, which is if a Best Buy closes down or goes, they decide to leave the town or whatever, for example, what does that Best Buy become? It's purpose-built to be a big box store, a big Best Buy. To change it is a huge amount of work. It can't be housing. It can't be offices. And the only people who win in that situation are people like Spirit Halloween, where they could just go in and change it into a pop-up shop, because that's their business model. So so that's something to think about. Is this type of form that's in the picture right now is a very, very flexible form of housing, or building, I should say. It's a very flexible type of building because you can have ground floor retail, or you can have ground floor offices, or you could maybe even change it back to be just a residential. You got the middle floor, which is residential, or it could be offices again, and the same with the top floor. So it can convert through all three of those types. Maybe industrial would be too far off the cards. Maybe if it has a rear loading bay, it could be a light industrial. But still, you've got that flexibility far more than, again, how we sort of approach things now, where, a townhouse will always be a townhouse. A big box store will always be a big box store. You'll have the designated office block that's glass and looks like an office block. It could be housing, and there's no way you could ever convert it. So, it's, yeah, it's one of those things.
Flex and change depending on how the city evolved over time. And it's no surprise that even when you look at ancient Roman cities, the same pattern was there as well. In the late 1940s, America started on a very different path, what Strong Towns calls the suburban experiment.
This is the American dream of freedom on wheels, an automotive age traveling on time-saving superhighways, Futurama's free-flowing channels of concrete and steel.
Instead of incremental development around existing infrastructure, huge neighborhoods were built from scratch on the edge of town. And instead of a mix of uses, residential neighborhoods were completely separated from commercial buildings, requiring a car to get between them. This probably seems normal to most people living in the US or Canada today. Since the suburban experiment began, several generations of people have grown up not knowing anything different. I certainly didn't until I moved overseas. But understand this was a drastic change from thousands of years of city evolution that we've had to date. We've now had over 70 years of the suburban experiment, and we now know that the experiment has failed. And it's not just because these suburbs are ugly, devoid of life, and soul-crushingly sterile. It goes deeper than that. Strong Towns has dozens of case studies showing why this is true, but I'll share one of their most prominent ones here. Now, Strong Towns actually explains this beautifully on their own YouTube channel, so if you'd rather hear it from them directly instead of listening to some random YouTuber, you can click on the link in the top right corner. These are...
So what they're about to do is something that we kind of do, well, different Strong Towns people and groups will do a lot to prove our point. And it's kind of, this is where Strong Towns, we're not a cult. We can prove scientifically our point using value and cost per acre analysis. So basically that's saying the taxable value of old style planning, or say also traditional style planning, the taxable value is usually always higher than the taxable value of suburban style planning. And the reason is that parking lots take up a lot of land but provide very little, next to no value in terms of what you could justify as adding to the value of the property to tax it. So it's just paved ground, right? It's just ground with pavement on it. And, parking lots in general are very detrimental to a city's finances because they don't pay very much in the way of tax. And so what he's about to do now is compare a suburban style fast food restaurant with a sort of traditional style strip of buildings and show how the taxable value is lower. So let's get into that.
Two identical blocks in a small town called Brainerd in Minnesota, the hometown of Strong Towns. They are exactly the same size, they are on the same road, they are serviced by the same infrastructure, they cost the city the same amount of money to maintain. They are identical in every way, except in their development style. The first one was built in the 1920s using the traditional style of development. It is a series of extremely basic structures, effectively the cheapest thing someone could build in this place in the 1920s. It's not exactly pretty, but it's functional, and it's flexible enough to meet the changing needs of the city, whether you need warehouse liquor, freedom firearms, or antiques and collectibles. But these buildings were never improved upon. Instead, after the 1940s, the city expanded rapidly outward, like every city in America, building into the suburbs instead of improving the places they already had. 2 blocks
this is
over
another
used
thing
to...
too that comes up a lot, which is that the car, the automobile, plus, the style of zoning regulations that was done, basically opened up a huge amount of land outside of cities that previously is not walk. You would never go there prior to the car because it would be too far from all the amenities down, in the core of the city. So prior to the vehicle, prior to people owning cars, the city would slowly expand outwards again because people would want to be near all the amenities they need, walking distance to jobs, coffee shops, restaurants, etc. So you had this very gradual outward, slow growth as these things sort of popped around the edge, or there might be a little new neighborhood right on the edge, and so on. Once the car came along, people were like, oh wow, I can live far away from the core of the city and drive downtown to get to all that stuff whenever I want. So I don't need to live right in the city anymore. I can live further out in the countryside. And that was facilitated even more so with suburban zoning, which allowed the cities to allow people to build all those houses out in the countryside, people to live in and then commute by car into the city. And that's kind of where this all began. It's all the car's fault, of course. So that also led to all the investment leaving the city as well. All the developers are pouring money into building suburbs, and not this sort of gradual expansion with keep making sure inside the core of the city, there's still many going there. So it changed that part as well, the financial aspect.
Look exactly the same. The city labeled it blight, which is urban planner speak for crappy and useless, and they bulldozed it. Then, a shiny new taco restaurant was opened in its place, using the modern suburban style of development. This development made everybody happy. It was a nice, new-looking building. It no longer had on-street parking, which improved traffic flow. The sign met the new code. It met the setback requirements. It even had pretty native plants and green space. Plus, now you can get Santa Fe burritos and bowls, pork streak tacos, flamin' hot Cheetos burritos, and even honey habanero chipotle barbecue bowl buffalo wing sensations. Furthermore, local guide Cynthia Endress said the lettuce didn't even taste funny. Why would the lettuce taste funny, Cynthia? Is this a common problem in Brainerd? This is literally the American dream. But nobody looked at the financial impact. That first block, the old, ugly 1920s era mismatched buildings, had a total taxable value of $1.1 million. The taco shop, on the same size lot with the same amount of public infrastructure spending, had a total taxable value of $800,000. Think about this for a second. That old, decrepit 1920s block brings over 40% more tax revenue for the city, and that's after over 90 years of neglect. Meanwhile, that taco shop is new, and it will literally never get more valuable than it is right now. It's only downhill from here. This brings us to a harsh reality. Suburban-style development, even at the beginning of its life, cannot outperform traditional development at the end of its life. Strong Towns has many other examples.
That's interesting. That's kind of what we talk about is, why is it? Well, why? Why are we doing this then? And it's because of regulation. Parking minimums mean there's partially parking on the lot. The whole design of the area is car-centric. So even if there weren't parking minimums, you would probably end up with a lot of parking there as well. So it's still less financially efficient. Zoning regulations that keep the height of the building down, suppress it to only one use, commercial instead of mixed use, because there was an idea that mixing uses was, I think there's obviously some element of classism. We don't want people, why would anyone live in an apartment in the suburbs? That's just weird. You're coming out of the city. Why would you be in an apartment? But, and maybe there's some element of that. If the houses are really cheap when you first build it, okay, you kind of see it. But as time goes on, it's not sustainable. As time goes on, you're eventually going to fill up all the space you have. And then, you're still not going to allow apartments when you've built all these neighborhoods of houses and the house prices are increasing. You're still going to say no, commercial only. And this is a problem we see, particularly, I would say here in Langley, we see it in the core, the downtown area of Langley, the certainly around sort of 200th Street and 64th Avenue area, where it's all zoned commercial and no residential is really allowed in amongst the commercial buildings or on top of the commercial buildings. So we are so committed to this very strict regulatory framework that not only delivers bad taxable value, it also delivers car dependency and a worse quality of life, because people can't just live near all the amenities and shops. They're forced to live away from them due to the zoning.
Well, such as this 19-acre double big box store development compared to 19 acres downtown. Despite the fact that the downtown is old and most of the upper floors are empty, it still brings in almost 80% more tax revenue than the big box store in the suburbs. If you'd like to read more, I'll link to some content by Strong Towns in the description. We do developments like this all the time in the US and Canada. We're building car-centric developments often at the edge of our cities and letting our productive traditional buildings rot away. But here's where we get back to flexibility. What happens when a big box retailer moves or goes out of business? We see the results of this all over America and Canada, especially in the case of Walmart, who typically only occupy their buildings for 15 years. The big box retailer moves on, and the city is left with a giant empty site. Meanwhile, there are hundreds of different tenants in a typical downtown. What happens when one of them goes out of business? Literally nothing. A small shop might stay vacant for a while, but the area is flexible. A retail store could become a coffee shop. An office could become an apartment. A liquor store could become a cannabis dispensary. But in any case, there is almost no scenario where all of these businesses disappear at once. To add to this
problem, that's the Strong Towns way, and I mentioned this earlier as well. What the point he just made about the flexibility of this style of development compared to the big box approach, but as exactly what he's talking about now, and where the name why it's really Strong Towns is because they are more resilient. You don't have one giant store, one giant superstore where everyone goes and does everything. It's lots of little businesses, and you might have it's a very maybe old-fashioned idea, and it can be hard to justify as well because the prices of those little shops, the products they make is often maybe more expensive. And something he doesn't talk about here is that per acre, these things are often subsidized too. The amount of property taxes they have to pay is effectively subsidized because the small shop will pay more property taxes per their square foot of space compared to a Walmart or whatever else. So the Walmarts are able to, or whatever the stores are able to sell products for less because they pay less property tax per square foot of livable area in the store. So that's another issue as well. And as I said, it's an old-fashioned idea, and I think culturally, we have, in North America, has been very quick to let go of it. Other countries haven't. Other countries like Italy, there's still that idea of the local baker, the local, produce store, local fruit and vegetable, that sort of thing is still in the heart of the culture, and maybe that's something we need to strive towards, or at least try and recreate that here. But I think it's hard because those places thrive in a walkable, people-oriented environment. It's one piece of the puzzle. There are many pieces to this puzzle. You can't just throw in a bakery store, and now we've got a strong town. You need to think about the whole city as a walkable community so that people might walk past the bakery on the way to somewhere else. A great example I always think of is in Vancouver on Main Street. There's a special, which I used to take my kids to, not anymore because they're older now and it's quite expensive, but it was a special kids hairdresser, a hair salon that did kids. They had little toy cars kids could sit in. And every time a child had finished their haircut with the parents of the kid, they'd walk get at the hairdresser, they'd walk across the street to the bakery, and then they'd get a cake as a treat. And that kind of relationship, those urban relationships, are all to do with allowing these kinds of traditional developments to grow and form, and not suppress them with zoning and regulation, or wait for a big developer to do a urban style center. It's just not scalable. It makes, again, it keeps it way too scarce. These kind of areas, like showing the picture of Battleborough, these kind of areas could be far more common, and they could be contributed to by smaller builders, and it built up over time if we just let it happen that way again.
Problem. Commercial properties are supposed to be the moneymaker. Suburban houses are even worse, but I'll talk about that in more detail in a future video. The American suburban experiment is trading a centuries-proven development pattern and replacing it with something that is not only financially unproductive, but also extremely fragile. On this channel, I don't hide the fact that I love walkable places. I believe they are more enjoyable to be in, they're more efficient, they lead to a better quality of life for the people who live in them. But I now know that car-centric suburbia is not just sucking the soul out of its inhabitants, it's making them poorer as well.
So there we are. Those two videos, all I'm going to do today. Really appreciate everyone who has watched this. This is our first time doing a stream, as I said. So, and that is basically the Strong Towns argument. And I think it's also the difference between, not to get too technical, if you may not know, there's also the idea of new urbanism, which came around in the 90s, which is stop building suburban sprawl. We need to build urban, etc., right? You need to build it in like how these places used to look. We need to plan it better like how those places used to look. And that is an improvement, but it's not addressing the underlying issues of community participation in the development process and the organic traditional development pattern. It's sort of a facsimile of that, and those places are still very locked in place. But as he said, it's suburban development is incredibly expensive, and he goes into more detail in another video. But what we see happen is, for the first 20 years or so, it's fine. And then as soon as the roads start to wear out, the sidewalks crack, sewer pipes have damage, water pipes need to be replaced, that's when the property taxes just don't come anywhere close to covering that true cost. And that's why we need to also say, we need to let what Chuck Barone talks about a lot, is letting the area mature. So the town needs to grow and develop and mature as a place, so that people, so people contribute, so they'll slowly add on things into their lots and property or change things. But in doing so, that increases, we talked about earlier, that value per acre amount. So it's easier to be able to afford to replace the road when the tax revenue is slowly increasing over the years, as opposed to being static or only increased with, you're not increasing with the population, you're increasing it just saying we need more money to fix this, which is very hard on residents too. So from a sort of more financially conservative standpoint, there's that benefit. And that's why this movement is so important. It's not just about aesthetics and how places look or feel. It's also about making places financially sustainable. And we'll go into that more in the next session as well.